Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to introduce Keir Lieber, professor in the School of Foreign Service and Department of Government at Georgetown University. Professor Lieber is one of the leading experts in nuclear weapons, nuclear strategy, and deterrence, as well as U.S. national security and IR theory. He's a co-author of The Myth of Nuclear Revolution, Power Politics in the Atomic Age, which he wrote with Dartmouth professor Dale Press. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can say this because Daryl's not here, Professor Press not here, but everything I learned about nuclear weapons, I learned from Daryl, particularly all the stuff about nuclear targeting and all the math that I was afraid of that he convinced me was still important. Okay, what I thought I would do is this. I've been given as much as 30 minutes, and maybe I'll be a little less than that. Hopefully I will be, although not if I keep doing all this throat clearing at the beginning. But what I want to do is talk about three ways in which the global nuclear environment is changing in disturbing or threatening or not very optimistic ways. Three kind of problems that I see continue to emerge. I'll summarize these as briefly as I can, and then I'll discuss, and maybe leave even more time for this, which discuss the uncomfortable implications or consequences for U.S. Nuclear policy, for U.S. grand strategy moving forward. So hopefully I'll focus as much on solutions as the problem, but it is important to understand the problem. And I see, again, three developments in the global nuclear environment. Some of these, if you've taken Dr. Press's course on nuclear weapons, you may be familiar with. I don't think we've ever brought them all together in one place, so I'm trying out some new things here. The first development, what we've referred to as the new era of counterforce, the counterforce revolution, and I hate to use lingo right off the bat, but let me explain what that means. The primary purpose of nuclear weapons for any state in the world, any country in the world, is primarily to deter nuclear attack by an adversary. And the primary means of deterrence is the threat of nuclear retaliation even after an adversary strikes you first. Okay, so it's the second strike that's the most important part, the ability to retaliate even if you get hit first. That's seen as the basis of deterrence. It's called second strike capability, and it's all about protecting, your arsenal from attack so that you can use it. Now, hopefully you'll never go down that road. If your adversary knows it can't disarm you, can't shoot your gun out of your hand, they're going to be less likely to shoot in the first place. During the Cold War, at least after the early 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were, if not locked in a condition of mutual second strike capability, they were in that condition. In the late 60s, neither the US nor the Soviet Union could imagine launching a first strike disarming the other. They were worried about it. Each side was worried about the other side doing that. But objectively, they seemed to be in this world where nuclear arsenals were survivable. There was a lot of competition based on that fear, but no real prospect of a complete disarming strike by either side developed. Partly that's because both the Soviet Union and the United States capitalized on all three of the pillars of survivability that countries can employ. So you want to protect your arsenal from first strike? There are three ways to do it, okay? Hardening, concealment, and redundancy. What do I mean by these? Hardening is about taking a missile, putting it in the ground, building a reinforced concrete silo, protecting it, putting mobile missiles in protected shelters, literally hardening them against foreign attack, against conventional weapons for sure, nuclear weapons as well. Second pillar of survivability is concealment. And here I don't just mean putting camouflage over something, but moving things around. So road mobile missiles that travel along roads or in the forest, submarines at sea. That's a form of concealment. You're using the ocean to conceal your nuclear capabilities. And then redundancy, and that just means building more of them. One way to make your force survivable is to build more weapons, more delivery systems, so that even if the adversary can take out some, it can't take out all. You need a portion of your arsenal to survive, to do retaliation, and you're good. The argument that Professor Press and I have made is that technology, the computer revolution, is essentially undermining the first two pillars. And specifically, the revolution in accuracy, munitions accuracy, the nuclear level and at the conventional level, have made hardened, static, stationary targets vulnerable to destruction. So, we have ICBMs in holes in the ground out there in the western United States. Adversaries know where those are, right? And if you know where something is these days, you can destroy it. You can certainly destroy it with accurate nuclear weapons, especially high-yield and accurate nuclear weapons. But increasingly, the accuracy revolution applies to conventional weapons that can pose a threat to other kinds of hardened forces. You're talking about even a conventional munition that's GPSed, and you can rely on GPS to get within 5 meters of a silo cap could destroy that silo. So the accuracy revolution is undermining or has undermined hardening as a principal strategy of survivability. The second one is remote sensing, using satellites to peer into your adversary's backyard to find things that are moving around. And then if you can find them, and you can find them at the moment you can get weapons on that, then those forces are vulnerable. So again, just in a nutshell, I'm happy to come back to any of this in the discussion, but I want to move on. Remote sensing revolution, and it is a revolution. We can peer out into space and see the beginning of the universe. We can now peer into your brain and see, nerve synapses firing. I mean, it's hard to find North Korean road mobile missiles, but it's not impossible. And is it going to be impossible to find big hunks of metal in the form of submarines at sea 50 years from now? I'm not sure, that's a safe bet. So understand this new vulnerability to attack against arsenals, the new vulnerability of nuclear arsenals is a global phenomenon, but it doesn't affect everybody equally. The United States force is very secure. We're not so worried about a first strike, but other countries have good reasons to worry, especially depending on the technological sophistication of their adversaries. But that impact, so that impact depends on technological sophistication. It also depends on redundancy, the remaining pillar of survivability. So it's not entirely surprising, to lead to my second emerging danger, that countries are building up their nuclear arsenals. And I'll take China as the best example of this, right? If its forces are vulnerable to, it's difficult to harden their silos, they're worried about their mobile missiles being found, well, what's left? Build more. And we are seeing today that even though China has long maintained a relatively small arsenal, right, in the low 200s of warheads level just a few years ago, is now clearly engaged in a major buildup. Just like a few months ago, maybe it was this summer, the Pentagon estimated that they would more than double their number of warheads from something like 300 to 700, and perhaps reach 1,500 warheads in the next decade. Today, I just literally minutes before coming over here, got a newsletter that told me that in Defense News there was an article that they think today China has 500 nuclear warheads as of May, and again, heading for more. Why is 1,500 important? 1,500 is important because currently the United States and Russia maintain about 1,500 strategically deployed warheads under the terms of the New START treaty, which Russia's kind of not following anyways, and we're not going to be able to renew it. And the point is not about whether everybody's going to be limited by the same type of a treaty. It's just that China is now emerging as a peer, a nuclear peer. And the reason that's significant, as we've been calling it emerging tripolarity, is that we've never been in that world, or nothing quite like it. We've never really dealt with this. We've always had kind of one major adversary and then a few regional nuclear adversaries, but never had to deal with two near-peer competitors at the nuclear level. So it's difficult to predict how all of this will play out, how dangerous it is, how the U.S. should respond. But I think it's safe to say that a new nuclear arms race is likely. If the United States sticks to its current nuclear mission, which is to deter nuclear attack on the United States or our allies by threatening unacceptable damage in retaliation after an adversary first strike, if we're going to stick with that mission and we're going to stick with our planning principles, which I won't get into, but are crucial to the prediction about a arms race, then I think it's inevitable the United States is going to build up its nuclear forces. We can do this pretty quickly by taking 1,000 warheads or 2,000 warheads from reserves and putting them on existing missiles. But just imagine we do that, China and Russia react to that, especially China. They build more, we'll respond to that, and we're in a kind of spiraling arms race. And it's difficult to see kind of a way out of that if we maintain our current planning principles and committed to the same mission. That leads to the third danger, the growing danger of nuclear escalation in the midst of conventional war. Okay, I'll probably spend a little bit more time on this one, and it directly relates to the implications for U.S. policy, but it should be a familiar problem if you know Cold War history in particular, and again, if you've taken Darrell Press's course, you've probably talked about this already. Here's the basic problem, okay? Conventionally weaker, so I'm making a distinction between nuclear power and conventionally power. We're talking about tanks and air forces and other kinds of non-nuclear missiles and artillery and things like that. If you have two adversaries and one of them is extremely weak conventionally compared to the other, and yet has nuclear weapons, this country, the conventionally weak country, is going to have huge incentives to use nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict because they're going to be losing badly. Right? If there's a war between the United States and North Korea, the North Korean conventional military is in pathetic shape. The United States is the strongest conventional military in the world. It's not even a close fight. It will be a devastating, in short order, North Korea will face the prospect of a devastating conventional defeat in a conflict. Under those prospects, the idea that North Korea, that Kim Jong-un, would use a nuclear weapon, or two, or three, in a kind of demonstration strike or against real targets, seems reasonable. Again, Kim Jong-un may be crazy. He may be delusional. I don't know. Maybe Putin's crazy and delusional. But the logic of escalation like this should make a lot of sense. You guys weren't even born, I don't know, I got to do the math. I'm really bad at math. But 2003, the Iraq War, what happens? Saddam Hussein didn't pursue nuclear weapons. We go in, we invade, we conquer Iraq, we arrest his sons, they get murdered, Saddam Hussein is hung on the gallows, in front of his worst enemies. Gaddafi doesn't pursue nuclear weapons, gave up maybe a program in return for what he thought was security, and loses a conventional war against adversaries, and again is murdered. The North Koreas of the world understand that dynamic, that if you lose a conventional war, really bad things happen, okay? Especially if you lose a war to the United States. And under these circumstances, using the one tool that you have to stop the conflict before it's too late makes a lot of sense. And so let's just take like a North Korea example. North Korea is unlikely to, if it has the capability, lash out and destroy Los Angeles as soon as it believes that it's going to lose this war. Instead, it detonates a weapon in its own territory, maybe against those forces that it's fighting against. But it's not the first shot that matters. What matters is to say, stop this war before it's too late. Stop the war before it's too late for me, okay? So remember, conventional inferiority leads to incentives to use nuclear weapons to stop the war before it's too late. This is why nuclear weapons are often described as weapons of the weak. They're more useful for those that are otherwise inferior at the conventional level. And if you're that country, why wouldn't you go up the escalation ladder? You're looking at death. You're looking at a coup. You're looking at getting overthrown by your people. You're looking at a really bad situation if you continue down the status quo. So this problem is not solely about, logic, abstract, strategic reasoning. Not that there's anything wrong with that, right? It's not just theory. We have a lot of evidence. And I know we don't teach, history anymore, but in the Cold War, does anybody know what the United States plan for defending NATO was? Defending Western Europe? Yes. Nuclear weapons. Nukes. We used to love nuclear weapons. I say this because now, of course, we don't. We say nukes are bad. You shouldn't have them. Why don't we all get rid of them? Even though I'm not going to do anything to actually get rid of mine. The point is, we used to love nuclear weapons because we were conventionally outmatched against the Soviet Union. In the beginning of the late 40s, when the Cold War gets going, we looked and we said, oh crap, we're not about to be able to fight a war to defend Western Europe, but we feared an invasion. So what did we do? We relied on nuclear weapons. We deployed, eventually, thousands of nuclear weapons. Again, at the beginning, it wasn't a big problem. We were just going to launch a strategic bombing campaign against Russia. They didn't even have nuclear weapons. They get them. They build a lot up, and now we got to find ways to make sure that a conventional invasion is met with nuclear use. And that's difficult to make credible, because if we use them, aren't they going to use them against us, and we're all dead? So what we did is we sprinkled tactical nuclear weapons all over Western Europe to our NATO allies. 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons are deployed. 21 different types of nuclear weapons. We're in West Germany alone because we wanted it to go nuclear, because that was the only way to pull our chestnuts out of the fire when the S hit the fan, right? So I get a little colorful here. Just understand that logic, that strategy is the exact strategy that conventionally weaker adversaries today understand makes sense for their own. And it doesn't have to be facing the United States. Look at Pakistan, faces India. Both have nukes, but the danger is that India is conventionally way more powerful than Pakistan. If Pakistan fights a conventional war, they're going to lose. They're going to lose quickly. Indian forces crossing the border. Most of Pakistan's cities are close to the border. This is a disaster if it stays at the conventional level. So you threaten nuclear escalation to deter that invasion from happening in the first place. And if the invasion happens, if deterrence fails, coerce a halt to the war before it's too late by using nuclear weapons. Okay? North Korea, I've kind of already alluded to this. I think there could be a conventional war on the peninsula tomorrow. If that happens, I think North Korea has huge incentives to use nuclear weapons right away, and we're going to be in a completely new era that, you heard it here first, okay? China, what do we do with China over Taiwan? Imagine China tries to do an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, and it fails because I think the current conventional balance of power looks like they probably would fail. That is a devastating defeat for the Chinese Communist Party. I made the joke earlier, like, what's the way that the Chinese government stays in power? It's not communism. It's not ideology that appeals to the people. And I made the joke that I'm more communist than the Chinese Communist Party. It's very true. It's not just because I voted for Bernie a couple of times. I mean, I think I believe those things. The point is, they ride the tiger of nationalism. Okay, and it's hard to be a strong nationalist defender of Chinese, integrity and garner respect when you lose Taiwan to the United States. So the question is losing that conflict enough to make China begin to use nuclear weapons in an escalatory fashion to send a signal that we have to stop the war, that we negotiate a stalemate, and the U.S. has lawyers and we'll say we won and negotiate a settlement, but. Again, that's the logic, and more countries are adopting it. And of course, the big case in Russia and Ukraine. There was some concern about whether Putin would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine early in the conflict, and it didn't help that Biden talked about, or Defense Secretary Austin talked about regime change, or Biden talked about regime change. We kind of dialed back the rhetoric, and that led some people to think, okay, yeah, this is not a problem, that Russia would never use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I don't know, man. I wonder what the betting line is, but I'm in some ways, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. I do know that if Ukraine's counteroffensive really succeeds and they push Russian forces entirely out of Ukraine, again, probably not going to happen, is that such a devastating defeat that Putin would have to think about resorting to nuclear escalation to coerce the United States and NATO to stop helping the Ukrainians, knowing that we are not going to go up that escalation ladder. You know, some Americans say, oh, we'll respond with a nuke ourselves. If they use nukes, we'll use nukes. I don't think so. I don't want to go down that path. Guess what? They care more about Ukraine than we do. Ukraine's not even a member of NATO. We have no official commitment to even do this. And as soon as our nose gets bloodied with a couple of nuclear weapons, I think we're going to think twice and wish we had never gotten involved in this in the first place. Okay, have I convinced you that this is a problem or dangerous enough? Let's talk about what the United States should do about all of this, and mainly about this third problem in particular. These are profound challenges in the nuclear environment. They're going to require way more serious discussion and policy debates than currently exist. This is why this talk is really important for Hamilton Society, which is about promoting debate and discussion on difficult issues. I understand that, the Hamilton Society leaning to have strong and principled U.S. leadership. That may be more problematic, and so maybe I'm going to say some things that you don't want to hear. But actually, the good news is all of the options are really bad and uncomfortable, right? Many of the key implications that I want to talk of these developments directly affect the credibility of America's commitment to our allies to extend a nuclear umbrella over them. And so we especially don't want to talk about them and have debates about them. But we have to ask these hard questions, even if any solution will be uncomfortable. And as I said, all of the solutions I can think of are just that, uncomfortable. So here they are. One solution is to try to take steps to bolster the credibility of the U.S. nuclear umbrella over allies, to deter an adversary from using nuclear weapons, North Korea against South Korea, China against other allies, by trying some of the same steps we implemented during the Cold War to convince the Soviet Union that we would defend NATO. Because we understood the problem. How do you make it credible that I'll use nuclear weapons that might result in me getting nuked to protect my friends? It's credible to defend my homeland. But, a bunch of Germans who were just, had fought World War II, and, this is a difficult thing to make credible. But we did a lot of things to make it credible. We did forward-based nuclear deployments, as I've already said. We put nuclear weapons on West European territory, so that they would be used. Maybe we could do this in South Korea. We used to have some nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula in South Korea. We took them out. Maybe it's now time to put them back in. Maybe, fine, putting nukes back in Japan is not exactly going to be that appealing. Maybe we keep them nearby or have forces that we can project to have nuclear weapons defending Japan in short order. Maybe we send nuclear weapons to the Baltics and Poland, right, to deter kind of Russian aggression there. Maybe we do nuclear sharing arrangements. So one of the things we did in the Cold War was to at least create the perception that our European allies would be able to use our nuclear weapons on their own to defend themselves. So you'd have West German pilots on West German planes with U.S. nuclear bombs attached to the wings. And at times, it's apparent that commanders in the field, nuclear artillery, and other weapons that we had, that those commanders would have the authority to use nuclear weapons without getting permission from Uncle Sam if they couldn't communicate with us or time was, of the essence. Now, I don't know about you, but you get, the Red Army pouring through the Fulda Gap. I'm going to be like, I don't have time to pick out my phone and call. I'm going to use nuclear weapons. And we wanted it that way. Again, don't get me wrong. So the problem is we worked hard at all of these different things to address the lack of credibility of that nuclear threat. And even then, it was really difficult to do. So I think there are good reasons to be skeptical that any of this would work today with allies like South Korea, the kinds of things that we're talking about. We struggled mightily to make it work in Europe during the Cold War, and it would be even harder today. And also, it doesn't really address the core logic of adversary nuclear use, right? What does it matter if our nuclear weapons are there or if the allies have control over them? You're not getting away from that fundamental strategic logic of nuclear escalation. All right, so that was just the easy one. Maybe we can do some things at the margin. Another solution then might be to allow some limited proliferation to our allies, especially the most vulnerable ones, where no other response makes sense. In other words, where we just can't make it credible that we would use nuclear weapons to defend these countries, we allow South Korea to get nuclear weapons, right? I don't think we would deliberately aid them or, for international diplomatic reasons, but we give the green light and they acquire their own nuclear arsenal. Again, we've had allies in the past get their own nuclear weapons in Israel and France and the UK. It's not so dramatically unprecedented. And in a time when our threat of nuclear retaliation may lack credibility, surely theirs would not. Right? Surely South Korea using nuclear weapons to defend itself is more credible than the United States using nuclear weapons to defend South Korea. Just recently, there was a lot of discussion in South Korea about acquiring their own nuclear arsenal. I went to Seoul last summer, told them that they should probably get their own arsenal. I didn't have much impact because the US diplomats got there first, and basically what happened was they patted him on the head and said, "We got you," and maybe twisted an arm, said, "We got you, don't get your own nuclear arsenal." And they had to go along for now, since they would need our acquiescence to get nuclear weapons of their own. But maybe that approach is unwise. Again, I'm just asking the question. Forget about my own views. Maybe we should greenlight them now to get nukes rather than later after there's been a nuclear war, right? What about Japan? You're like, oh no, my God, of course Japan can't get that. Everyone wants to believe that a Japanese nuclear arsenal is impossible. You can't go there because of history. That the only victims of an actual nuclear attack, could never go down that path. But their stance is way more qualified than people are willing to admit. They've said that their embrace of the United States and their willingness to rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella is based on the credibility of that umbrella, the credible commitment of the United States to protect them. And in fact, they've acquired the technology to build nuclear weapons. They've acquired the plutonium to do this very quickly, if they need to. Again, we can't do it for them, but we may need to acquiesce and acknowledge that. Okay, you don't like either of those options? I got two more. Third solution would head in a totally different direction. And that would be a reinvigorated embrace of new capabilities, new technologies to restore deterrence, right? Don't run away from the problem, embrace it. Quantitatively, qualitatively build up your nuclear arsenal, qualitatively, quantitatively build up your conventional military power to restore some semblance of superiority or primacy, which people forget is the original form of deterrence. And everybody's got so used to mutual assured destruction, my fear, and it's the mutual balance of terror, blah, blah, blah. How about good old-fashioned, I will kick your butt if you start to go down the nuclear road, right? That is a fair, argument one might make. And the point is, it would bolster deterrence. And, if you want to make this argument further, despite the hypocritical U.S. approach to the NPT, where the United States, like all other nuclear powers, maintains the fiction that we are taking concrete steps toward nuclear disarmament, the fact of the matter is the United States has reduced the size of its nuclear arsenal by over 80% since the end of the Cold War. Qualitatively, we've reduced and foregone all kinds of capabilities that might be useful for counter-force strikes, holding your enemy's arsenal at bay, that maybe these would have been useful today. Was that a mistake? I don't think so. At the time, seemed like a wise decision. There had to be some peace dividend from kind of winning the Cold War. But even if it seemed reasonable at the time, maybe the time times have changed, and maybe now it's different. Maybe now it's time to ramp back up again. Not just because China's building up its arsenal and Russia has already modernized its arsenal. The United States is not. We're undergoing modernization effort right now to replace aging nuclear weapons, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to do more. I would actually say that the consensus in Washington, even though, again, it's Washington, D.C., even though it's not, again, something that anybody really wants on the front page of the newspaper, but the United States, the consensus is we do need to do more, that we are pursuing nuclear modernization. Some of you may even, it's a little inside baseball, but the latest Strategic Posture Commission just came out with its report. And it was a bipartisan, congressionally appointed commission. The recommendation is we got to build everything and more. I mean, you can go read it. It's pretty stunning. It was a consensus opinion. So even the kind of supposedly lefties or doves on the commission agree that the threats were gathering and we needed to respond. Now, those weren't exactly the doves that I would have appointed if I wanted a more dovish solution, but so be it. There appears to be a bipartisan consensus at a time when there's no bipartisan consensus about basically anything else that the United States needs to build up its nuclear arsenal. Okay, so that's good news if that's the path you want to go on. The fourth and final path, maybe the most radioactive, pun intended, here, and that's to ask the question, should we pare back our commitments? Should we retrench? Should we pull back from some of these commitments of extending the nuclear umbrella to protect all kinds of countries around the world? Right? We extend the nuclear umbrella to something like several dozen countries. We've either made explicit through alliance commitments or suggested that they don't need to get nukes because we will protect you. Just understand, this is not about isolationism, come home America. That's not really practical anymore, and it might very well be dangerous. I'm not advocating that myself. But today we need a serious debate about whether we should be committed to our current allies, partners, and friends all around the world, despite the very serious risk of nuclear war, right? In the Cold War, we had a fairly robust debate about whether protecting Western Europe was worth it. Right? We had that debate. Was it a vital U.S. national security interest, even if it meant risking all-out nuclear war? We had that debate, and we pretty much decided, yes, it was worth it. But we've never had that debate about Taiwan, right? Which is why everyone, including Biden and the Chinese, don't know what our position is on Taiwan. Are we going to protect them or not? I mean, Biden says, hey, well, we're going to protect Taiwan if war comes, and then his national security advisor says, whoa, wait a minute here, we're not, because we've never really decided. As American people, have you ever been asked, would you risk Los Angeles getting nuked to protect Taiwan? I'm not saying no or yes, but that question needs to be asked. We haven't had a serious debate about South Korea and our commitment to South Korea, even though a lot has happened in the meantime. North Korea got nuclear weapons and is now building the capability to target the U.S. homeland. How is it that we haven't said, maybe we should readdress, reconsider, think about? If you want to stay, that's fine. Just make the argument, lay it out there. Let's have the debate. No debate. We've never really had a debate about Ukraine, right? I mean, we didn't even really debate whether we should begin to supply them. We didn't debate whether actions that we were taking to expand NATO were going to have any impact, possibly lead to a war against Ukraine. But it's not even a NATO ally. I mean, again, it's just so amazing that we are arming Ukrainians and they are killing large numbers of Russians in this war. That, again, is Putin's fault, fine, whatever. The question is, this might well provoke nuclear war. So go back to the beginning. Is our commitment to Ukraine worth it? Why don't we have that debate? Bottom line is, everyone should ask themselves and their political representatives whether these places are of such vital national security to the U.S. that we're willing to risk getting hit with nuclear weapons someday. I'm not being hyperbolic here. I like to be hyperbolic, have fun, but I'm not engaged in threat inflation here. If you agree with the logic of North Korean nuclear escalation in the face of a devastating defeat in a conventional war, then you should agree with me. I think about Saudi Arabia, that recently the United States had discussions with Saudi Arabia about whether if Iran got nuclear weapons, we would extend the nuclear umbrella to Saudi Arabia. right? We don't even need their oil anymore, right? Aren't we a net exporter? It's one thing to argue about this in the old days, but we're going to bring them under the nuclear umbrella. Again, it may make sense, but does the average American, much less the future leaders of the foreign policy elite, ever have to consider this question in advance before we find ourselves going down that road? Sometimes it makes me wonder whether there are any areas of the world that the U.S. is not willing to risk nuclear war to defend. I think that's wrong. Real bottom line here is that we need to end this vacation, this holiday, from serious nuclear thinking, from seriously thinking about the nuclear dangers that exist out there. We've been on this holiday, this vacation, basically since the end of the Cold War. Things have improved a little bit. We're having some nuclear debates, but it's largely a discussion that falls by the wayside pretty quickly. We need to undertake objective analyses of risks, of the balance of power. We need to ask tough policy questions. And ultimately, and that's all I'm asking for, is that we need to make sure that whatever our core national interests are, that we've defined as vital national interests, match or at least come into better balance with our foreign commitments and the risks that those commitments entail. I'll stop there. Sorry, I went on 5 minutes longer than I meant to. Thank you.
So we'll get going with some Q&A now from the audience. So Charlie's wandering around with microphones if anyone has any questions to start us off.
Do you have an idea about whether if a nuclear weapon was used in the third scenario for the first time, whether that would almost normalize it? Would we go down a road where it is more likely to use nuclear weapons more often?
Should I answer each one? Yeah, so, okay, one response is simply to say, for the country that's deciding to use a nuclear weapon, that doesn't matter. All that matters is their survival and whether or not they can suffer this conventional defeat or use a nuclear weapon. They don't care about the nuclear taboo or international ramifications from having used it. They don't care whether their use of it will make it more likely that others will use it. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, because that is kind of important. It doesn't matter for that country. In D.C., Washington, D.C., they often talk about, if a nuclear weapon is used, what we need to do is restore deterrence, right away. And as I said earlier this afternoon to a smaller group, that I don't know what that means. I mean, you can't go back. You're not going to be able to restore deterrence. You might be able to stop that nuclear conflict and make nuclear weapons so they're not used again in that conflict. But I don't put a lot of faith. The answer to your question is, I don't have a lot of faith in the nuclear taboo in the first place. How widespread is it? Is it just in the United States that we supposedly believe in the nuclear taboo? Does North Korea believe in it? Does India or Pakistan or Russia, China? I don't think so. How strong is it? Is it like, yeah, I think it's bad to use nuclear weapons, but if it's going to save this many more lives, I'll use nukes. I mean, that doesn't seem like a taboo, right? Taboo is supposed to be something that's like, just don't do it, like cannibalism. But even in that case, your plane crashes in the Andes and you need to eat people, you're going to eat people, okay? The point is, the nuclear weapons prohibition or taboo doesn't really feel like as strong a taboo as we think. And then, of course, the last thing is, once the taboo is broken, what impact will that have? I don't think it'll open the floodgates and all of a sudden now we treat nuclear weapons like anything else, because they're enormously destructive. They are a great deterrent. But, I don't think you're talking about a dramatic change. Once a nuclear weapon is used. We've already used 2 nuclear weapons in history, of course. So this would be a significant development. But at the end of the day, we need to look at why a country would use it to understand whether or not additional nuclear use would happen.
Check. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you told the South Koreans or you advised them to build their own nuclear weapons. I
Is
was
this on the
wondering,
record over here? Yeah.
sorry? I was just wondering why it's your position that like the U.S. nuclear umbrella isn't reliable enough for them to rely on it.
Yeah, well, the argument I made, and I didn't come down and say explicitly they should build their own arsenal. Again, maybe over drinks later on, but at the official talk, I mean, the argument is simple, is that as North Korean nuclear capabilities are growing, specifically as North Korea gets to the point where it could use nuclear weapons against the United States. It could fire a long-range, ballistic missile and hit Los Angeles or Chicago or whatever. That undermines the credibility of our deterrent. When we could say that we'll use nuclear weapons against you if you use them, that was easier to say when we weren't going to get bloodied. I mean, yes, our allies might get their noses bloody, but not the U.S. So it's just reasonable, rational to assume that as the threat grows to you, your commitment to defend an ally at the risk of nuclear war is going to be undermined. And I said that I don't know what the solution is. I didn't think that nuclear sharing, forward deployment, any of these other solutions would really get at the fundamental problem. And so we just said I wanted to encourage that debate in their own country. And again, their view is, oh, well, we can't do it if the U.S. won't, doesn't help because the international condemnation, if we go nuclear, but it wasn't like we can't do that. I mean, in like a normative sense or any other reason, they understand the strategic problem, but they also understand the cost of going their own way, not really worth it right now. And I think for now, that debate has subsided, but it's not going away. And the day that North Korea demonstrates that it can miniaturize a warhead, put it on an ICBM, launch it halfway across the planet, and have it detonate, it's going to raise these issues once again. And that's not going to be the only development. So how do you address the lack of credibility as their arsenal grows? I don't know what the solution is.
Very interesting, and thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and observations about the situation. I came in a few minutes late, so if you already dealt with this, just skip it. But I'm curious about what's the status currently of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Is it something we should really be following, and is it helping the world? Should it be adjusted?
Yeah, I mean, look, I wouldn't get rid of it. It doesn't really constrain us. In some ways, it might help us, but it's a useful fiction for basically everybody who signed up to it. If you take the commitments that are in the treaty seriously, which is that the nuclear powers, the haves, compared to the have-nots, the haves are going to take meaningful steps to get rid of their nuclear arsenals. That's just, there's been, maybe getting rid of 80% of your arsenal is a demonstration of that, but nobody believes that. Nobody believes that the United States is going to disarm. And I don't expect Israel to disarm, and nor does anybody else. So the question is not whether, the NPT is what we've always dreamed it is. The question is just, is it worth doing anything to get rid of? I mean, basically, you saw today, I think it was today, that Russia has formally withdrawn from the nuclear test ban treaty. And I see the nuclear proliferation regime as a bunch of treaties, not just the NPT, but test ban treaty and all the rest. So they've officially pulled out. The United States pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the ABM treaty, when it no longer served our purpose. We left it. North Korea left the NPT when it decided it wanted to build nuclear weapons, and it had a legal right to do that. So I just think it's important not to put these treaties up on a pedestal. They're tools of states to manage their own affairs. And I think some of the credibility of the NPT has been undermined, and its relevance was never that great, in my view. Again, I hate to anger anybody about this, but so it just doesn't matter as much. But most nuclear arms control is just in deep trouble. And nobody is optimistic that there's going to be a nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and China or Russia. It seems like it's not in my lifetime kind of talk.
Thank you for making the trip up. I noticed that, throughout your speech that you've never really mentioned disarmament, and it seems pretty clear why countries nuclear armed countries won't have the incentive to disarm itself. But yet in history, we've seen countries like South Africa disarm itself. What changed now? What's different now? And do you personally believe that we can ever see a world where a nuclear armed state disarms itself?
The answer is no, but I assume I should elaborate a little bit on this issue. Look, you can take each case in its own context, and we can talk about why South Africa disarmed, or why Ukraine didn't try to keep the nuclear weapons that were on its territory at the end of the Cold War. But the bottom line is different states have different inclinations to need nuclear weapons depending on the strategic context. Again, back when we really needed nukes, both in World War II and then in the Cold War, we had no problem developing it. We didn't say that these were evil. The Soviets approached us and said, hey, let's get rid of nukes. And we said, go take a hike. There was no way we were going to do that. And there's no way a country like North Korea is going to give up what it sees as its vital tool of national security today. But I'll even be more provocative. I think a nuclear-free world is not a world that I want to live in. Nuclear weapons have contributed to the lack of great power war. And in other words, have contributed to peace and stability. They're not a silver bullet. They don't eliminate competition and conflict as we see in the world today, but they are a great deterrent. And they've allowed weak countries to remain in existence. Just ask yourself, if Poland in 1939 had nuclear weapons, or let's say you could go back in time and give them nuclear weapons before Germany started World War II by attacking Poland, I think I'd do it. There are millions of people whose ancestors perished in that conflict that would love to run that experiment, and I think it would have led to a more peaceful world. So number one, you want to make the world safe for conventional war again if we get rid of nuclear weapons? I don't want to run the experiment. Second thing is, it's just never going to happen. So why do we pursue something that's never going to happen? Because states have differing interests, and some will always want it. And third, even if we somehow could trick everybody to go down the path and get down toward zero, Thomas Schelling said before he passed away that would be a very nervous world. It would be everybody eyeing each other carefully and saying, are they going to do a breakout capability and build without me knowing about it? Let's say we all go to zero, and then all of a sudden one country says, hey, guess what? I've got 100 of these, and if you even think about getting your own nuclear weapons, I'll nuke you. So, that's another, as we get closer. So the process itself could be destabilizing. So you pick, your adventure. It's a bad idea if we could even do it. We'll never be able to do it, and trying to do it is going to lead to trouble. That's why I have no inclination to advocate for nuclear disarmament.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Do you think there's a possibility that a nuclear power would use nukes against a non-nuclear power for cost efficiency or other rational reasons?
Yeah, it's a fair question and a really good question. I don't think I have an answer. In Vietnam, the United States at least contemplated whether nuclear weapons would be useful in that conflict. After 9/11, we talked about whether or not using a nuclear weapon, against the Taliban in Tora Bora in Afghanistan would make sense. So the least I can say is that countries do contemplate this. Why don't they? I'm not sure that the kind of strategic necessity has really emerged in that way. Now, that might be a cop-out. Someone could say, well, why wasn't Russia just use nukes now against all these Ukrainian forces? I don't know what the answer is. I mean, what the international community is going to condemn them? They're already under sanctions. They're already under pressure, Would China abandon them because they did that? I don't think so. China wants to play kissy face with Russia because the U.S. is enemy number one. That's not going to change anything. So I don't know. What am I missing? What do you all? There's a lot of both smart people in this room, whether you're an expert or not, why do you think states haven't used them against non-nuclear powers? You don't have to answer. I'm on the hot seat, so. Maybe it's a nuclear taboo. I don't know. I don't think so, but.
What's the deal with Iran? They seem to be an outlier.
How are they an outlier?
I think they're religiously motivated, and they would be, I think, willing to invest just a small group of people to inflict harm for no particular reason.
Yeah, I don't share that view.
Okay.
I think Iran, if anything, has been shown to be an incredibly strategic actor, not interested in suicide, right? Because if the scenario is Iran, as soon as they get nuclear weapons, will lash out against, will nuke Tel Aviv, and they'll die in retaliation from Israeli nuclear retaliation, but they'll go to heaven and have 72 virgins and all this stuff. I don't buy that. I don't buy that. They want to remain in power. They're rational actors, and they behave that way. Look how they've perfectly managed, getting Israel in this situation. I think they're, definitely behind Hamas's, rearmament and actions, whether they plan this attack or not, but they've played it just about right. This is a rational actor. They're not interested in suicide, and they're not going full force to acquire nuclear weapons, right? The nuclear deal in the Obama administration was a great solution in my mind, a temporary solution maybe, but it froze the program. Israel would know when Iran, if they were breaking the agreement or moving close to getting a nuclear weapon. That's what they do now. If Iran takes the final steps to build a weapon, they may preempt. I would expect them to preempt. They may need U.S. help in doing this to really destroy the kind of targets they need to destroy. But I would caution you to, ask yourself why you think it. First thing Iran would do is, acquire nukes and use them against Israel. We also said the same thing about China acquiring nuclear weapons, about Russia acquiring Soviet Union. Holy cow, we can't allow them to get nuclear weapons. Maybe we should preempt. Maybe we should destroy, preventive strike. China, when it was about to get nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union approached the United States and said, hey, do you want to whack them before this happens, right? So people worry all the time about what will happen when a country gets them and that they're irrational. And I think they might be irrational, but if you've got a rational story staring you in the face, why not just start with that and then figure it out from there? Kim Jong-un is rational, I think, and he's not interested in dying. Just throw it out there for you to consider.
Thanks. Okay. So as of right now, North Korea is obviously the only country that has withdrawn from the NPT to start its own nuclear program. And my question is, if another country were to do that, whether it be Iran or any other country, could you see a proliferations cascade happening? Do you think that, in this time period, because I think North Korea withdrew in 2003, but now in 2023, could you see that being a large enough security threat to cause a bunch of countries to withdraw from the NPT and kind of have this domino effect of proliferation?
Yeah, it's a good question, although I wouldn't tie it to the NPT. There's no need to tie that question to the NPT, right? The question is just if Iran gets nuclear weapons, will you get a proliferation cascade? Reasonable people can disagree. We should be debating this question. I think the answer is no. I would expect Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons and, at least, possess the bomb. Who knows, how big of an arsenal, anything like that. I would expect maybe Egypt follows. But then what? I don't see the logic of a cascade. Let's say South Korea gets nuclear weapons. What happens then? That presumes the U.S. basically is withdrawn from the region, so maybe Japan gets them. But then what? China already has them. I wouldn't expect Vietnam or the Philippines to, follow quickly. There are costs to being a nuclear power. It comes with a lot of effort, money and effort to, deterrence is a serious business. And moreover, when you first join the nuclear club, you got to worry about being a victim of attack. You know, there's a famous saying, you know, when does a nuclear arsenal stop becoming a target and start becoming a deterrent? It doesn't happen automatically. So Iran with nukes is very nervous that it will be attacked. It's not a simple decision for countries to do that. So again, all that's a long way of saying that I don't worry as much about a nuclear cascade. History has not shown that to happen, and things usually happen. U.S. gets it, so Soviet Union got it, China got it, you know, a bunch of other countries follow. So maybe I'm, you know, whistling in the dark, and I'm such an optimistic person, as you can tell already, that maybe that's the problem. But you might have a different argument, but you'd have to spell out which countries and why, not just leave it as a fear of a cascade, I guess what I would say.
So the U.S. has a nuclear defense system that, albeit is not very sophisticated with the idea of intercepting missiles. It's not very sophisticated at the moment. Do you believe that it would be a worthwhile venture to be a game changer in the world for the U.S. to invest further resources in developing this system?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I find myself, you know, not being opposed to spending more on missile defense. I don't like to spend money on things that don't work. And so I'd push us to pursue, you know, theater missile defenses, terminal defenses, boost phase defenses, as much as mid-course intercept, which is a lot harder to do against a sophisticated adversary. But I'd also say it depends on what the opportunity costs are. If you're saying let's spend $50 billion on something, I'd like to know what else I could spend that on. And maybe that's on, you know, better electronic signals intelligence or jamming or cyber or something else. Maybe it's offensive strike capabilities, precision conventional strike, that we could send something halfway around the world and destroy a nuclear target from our own country, you know, launching it from the US. So maybe, but again, those are kind of, you have to get into the weeds about what the opportunity costs are. We've made a lot of progress on missile defense, but again, just against a sophisticated adversary, I wouldn't rely on that. Maybe rely on it to mop up remaining nuclear weapons after you've had to try to disarm a country like North Korea? Sure. But, you know, as something, the way that some people talk about missile defense, I'd be very cautious and skeptical.
Hi, thank you for coming. Are there any kind of negative externalities in your mind associated with making nuclear threats that allies don't see as credible? Like, do you think that the fact of making non-credible threats maybe erodes other parts of the alliance? Or is the main issue just that they are not credible?
Yeah. So is sticking with a non-credible commitment, you know, why is that a bad thing? I guess another way of asking it, right? And, you know, maybe it's just you know, I'm an honest person and I hate to, you know, lie and deceive and all the rest. That's not the argument that I would make, though. It's that we do ourselves no favor in projecting certainty about something that we may not do in the end. And if our adversary is skeptical of the credibility of our threats and takes action, that's a problem. So why not come up with something that is credible, even if it means putting nuclear weapons in the hands of allies, for example? That would be, by definition, more credible than, you know, the United States, if they have enough and they're not vulnerable and all the rest. So I just, you know, and again, there's, I swim in an aquarium in DC of fish that are always talking about rhetoric and diplomacy, and, you know, it's, you say one thing and you do another, and rarely does that ever like seem to work very well. Others aren't fooled by our lies, you know, and in many ways they even lose more credibility when we look them in the eye and tell them, hey, don't worry about this. That's when you should be really worried, you know? So I think there's strategic benefits to honesty and grappling with problems. If it were, I mean, the bottom line is we just don't even discuss this stuff, and so at the level anywhere near the level we need to. So, yeah, that's my view. It's a good question.
So, Keir, I got a question. You said, end the vacation on hard nuclear thinking and have the debate. How do we go about that? What are the incentives to start that debate in the U.S. or anywhere? Where should it happen? Who should be having it? Because in the Cold War, early Cold War, it was something brand new, right? It happened within the academic community, hadn't happened before in military. So how do you see that logic to get that conversation going?
Okay, so it's not a question about whether we should have the debates.
No, it's how.
Right. No, because some people respond and say, well, why? Why do we need to have these debates? And that's, the answer to that question is just, you're playing with fire. If you don't discuss these things before they happen, you're going to lose way more. This commitment to just the American people need to understand what we're doing and why, in part because that will force leaders to articulate the reasons why, and maybe they'll come upon a realization that they're making a mistake and to correct it. How do we do it? We do it, first of all, here. Okay, there's a good chance that one or two or three or more of students in this room will go on into policy making, policy guidance roles in the U.S. government or the intelligence community, et cetera, and be more comfortable then in those positions expressing their views or skepticism, et cetera. In D.C., it's, the blob is real, the swamp is real, that, the extent of the debate that we can have is really narrow. To question, to say what I said here, I'm never going to serve in government. And I know that, so I can say that. I'm just never going to do it. I probably couldn't get a clearance, but that's less of the issue, because I'm a communist. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. My own humor trips me up sometimes. But to be at a think tank, Brookings or a CSIS, or have a hope of going into the next administration that's in your political, corner, to say controversial things is a death sentence. It's an end to your career if it's really controversial. And the consensus view in Washington, D.C. is that the United States needs to lead, needs to capitalize on its superiority, its military prowess, its economic prowess, its liberal ideas to kind of straddle the globe and help run the world and be a paragon of virtue for others. I'm barely exaggerating on this, but that space, the space in which we can have a debate, is incredibly narrow. I'm not even that. I would just like the debate on nukes to take place in public, even if it's bounded by that, because I think there still are some debates. I mean, whether to build certain weapons, whether to deploy them, whether to take on new allies. I mean, we should be able to have that debate without, controversy. So, I don't know, write op-eds, write books, articles if you're a scholar. I encourage students, to think about these things. I don't know. Do you have any good ideas that I'm?
That's what I'm looking for. What about the military? Does the military have a role?
Yeah. Well, Darryl Press and I have spent some time taking our work out to to military folks, just over the years, doing briefings in the Pentagon and different offices and things like that. Obviously, we also try to talk to civilian policymakers outside of the Pentagon, but often it's civilians and military people in government, because, take the nuclear escalation example in North Korea, right? If you believe that fighting a conventional war on the Korean Peninsula could lead to nuclear war, one of the things you might want to do is go and talk to conventional commanders and say, hey, have you thought about which actions you might take that might lead to escalation? And that could be avoided. Maybe don't go after leadership targets right away. Maybe don't hit sensitive targets right away. And, we've had some fun trips because we like getting beat up, but, a lot conventional in the U.S., it's so stovepipe. There's nuclear command and there's conventional commands. And the conventional warfighter's like, hey, man, my job is to, kick North Korea's ass and win. And Stratcom is the nuclear command. They're like, we don't want nuclear escalation, but how do you get them to talk to each other? Things have improved. I'd say, the awareness in Korea among the military command about the danger of escalation is better today than it was 10 years ago. And not because of what Darryl and I did, because this is so obvious to kind of come to this realization that we're in some deep kimchi here. We better think about it now, not after the nuclear war happens. So, that nice, nifty reference there.
One last question.
Yeah, so I have a question about, you mentioned that we're in a tripolar world. And
Emerging
tripolar world. And there are others here who might disagree as to whether that's actually true or not. But staying just in the realm of nuclear.
Sorry, emerging nuclear tripolar.
Right,
I should have
just
said that.
staying in the realm of nuclear tripolar.
Yes.
Do you have evidence that, besides just the number of nukes that China is building, that they have anything approaching the kind of capabilities that you and Daryl are talking about the United States developing?
Well, again, it depends on what you mean. We're just talking overall numbers. It's one thing when China had 200 warheads, and the United States has 1,550 deployed. And now we're at 500 today, as Defense News story from yesterday or today said, that the U.S. government now believes they have 500 deployed nuclear warheads, that they're heading to 1,500 in less than 10 years. You know, that assumes the U.S. stays still, so maybe you're expecting the United States and Russia to build up. But we're now in the neighborhood of a kind of strategically deployed parity that, you know, seems fundamentally different. Again, if you want to say it doesn't matter at all, you certainly, one can certainly make that argument, and you could. There are people who say we don't need to respond to every adversary's, you know, nuclear acquisition, that we've got enough, you know, to retaliate in almost any scenario. But the problem is that's not how military planners and civilians think about, you know, a rainy day scenario. We're going to, because of the planning principles that we adhere to, we are not going to sit still while China, you know, quadruples its arsenal. I don't really, you know, I don't know that many people who think they can say we shouldn't. Again, that's a separate issue. But what we will do, if we stick to our current mission, current alliance commitments, current planning principles, I don't see how we can avoid building more. And then that's going to lead to, you know, additional Chinese building and Russian building. And who knows? Maybe there'll be a coup in Russia and China tomorrow, and then, you know, that won't happen. And there are a lot of things that can happen. I'm not in the business of making predictions. I just think that the incentives for us to engage in a nuclear arms race are pretty clear.
Well, on that note, thank you all for coming. Let's give the professor one last round of applause.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.